Did you know there used to be a Muslim kingdom in Vietnam? You see, in the late 600s, Muslim merchants from Arabia and later Somalia and Persia and India began sailing to the lands as far away as China, connecting lands between them and establishing trade routes by sea. And at the time, much of Southeast Asia was ruled by Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms, each competing with others over control of the sea. But as these Muslim sea merchants from the West began arriving on the shores, buying and selling goods and building relations with the locals, many of them began giving dawah to the native peoples of Southeast Asia until eventually a few small kingdoms accepted Islam. From there, these kingdoms formed marriage alliances and trade agreements with others, and soon Islam was spreading from one royal family to another until after a few hundred years, eventually, most of modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia had become Muslim as well. But while all this was happening, there was one country which almost no one knows about, which was undergoing the same transformations in its society and was slowly converting from Hinduism to Islam. And that country was Vietnam. And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my Patreon, link in the YouTube video description or on my TikTok profile. Anyway, you see, in the 600s, southern Vietnam was mostly controlled by the kingdom of Champa. And over the next few hundred years, Muslim merchants arrived on the shores of the kingdom, and by the early 1000s, Islam was beginning to spread among the locals. Soon after, many members of the Cham royal family had converted to Islam as contact with Muslim kingdoms from Malaysia and Indonesia increased. Islam was a small minority religion, but it was clear that just like Malaysia and Indonesia and even Brunei, the kingdom of Champa was on its way to eventually becoming a Muslim nation. And that's when tragedy struck. In 1080, an army from the neighboring Khmer Empire attacked the Champa kingdom, reaching as far as the capital city of Vijaya. However, the Cham were able to defend the city, but the damage had been done, and all-out war was declared. For the next 100 years, several wars were fought between the Cham and the Khmer. Raids were launched, cities were destroyed, and at one point, Champa even fell into civil war due to all the political chaos. But by the 1200s, the Khmer were eventually able to conquer Champa and annex it into their empire. But perhaps because the kingdom had been weakened by constant war, it gave way to another wave of Muslim influence which came from one of the most bizarre and unlikely places. You see, throughout the 1200s, the Mongol Empire was spreading across the plains of Asia, conquering from Baghdad in Iraq all the way to China. And because of this, many of the old Muslim generals and politicians from the Muslim nations were brought over to eastern China and incorporated into the Mongol government and army. Eventually, much of China would be ruled directly by Muslims, and so when the Mongol emperor decided to invade the whole region, his Muslim governors and generals took the opportunity to spread Islam. This influence became so great that when Ibn Battuta visited Champa in the 1340s, he described the princess who met him, spoke Turkish, and was literate in Arabic, and wrote out the Bismillah in calligraphy in front of him. The Muslim minority of Champa continued to grow, and soon they would become the majority. But Champa was still a Hindu state at the time, and the Mongol invasions forced them to mend ties with the neighboring kingdom in the north, another Hindu nation which they had fought many times. In a show of solidarity, the Dai Viet king offered his daughter's hand in marriage to the king of Champa, and in return, Champa ceded 2 provinces to the Dai Viet as a wedding gift. An alliance had been made, and it seemed as if peace between these 2 warring nations was now set in stone. But what neither side realized at the time was that this peace agreement would lead to the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and one of those 2 nations would eventually be completely annihilated, never to recover. You see, about a year after the marriage, the king of Champa died. And at the time, the Hindus had a tradition called sati, in which the husband who had died would be cremated in a bonfire, and his widow would sit on top of the funeral pyre, burning herself alive. Well, the Dai Viet princess was not interested in that, and refused to sacrifice herself during the funeral. Seeing this as a national disgrace, the king's son sent an army to recapture the 2 provinces they had gifted the Dai Viets, beginning a war which would last 23 years and take thousands of lives. In the end, neither side was able to defeat the other. Both nations were severely weakened, and the borders between them remained the same. But while Champa languished, Dai Viet eventually managed to restore itself to power with the rise of Vietnam's most powerful emperor. In 1471, the Dai Viet emperor launched a new war against Champa, completely crushing the kingdom and besieging the capital city. After 4 days of intense bombardment, the city fell and over 100,000 people were either killed in the fighting or later executed, and the rest of the Champa people were enslaved and assimilated into Dai Viet society. One Cham general managed to escape the onslaught and fled with his army to the south, establishing the rump state of Panduranga. It was all that was left of the once almighty kingdom of Champa, but the story of Islam in the region did not end with the fall of Champa. Rather, over the next few hundred years, as the Cham people spread across the region as refugees, Islam grew more popular amongst them until eventually the majority of them had accepted Islam. These Cham Muslims migrated to neighboring Cambodia and Thailand, while others sailed to Malaysia and Hainan Island in China. The rest still remain in Vietnam, however, a small Muslim minority, remnants of a Muslim state that could have been. Like it follow for more Muslim facts.